You ever seen a patch that makes a room go quiet? The question came out of nowhere, low and amused, cutting through the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the muted chatter inside the operations bay. But no one answered because no one thought they needed to. Not in a room full of Delta operators who had spent years earning the right to laugh at anything that didn't meet their standard. Especially not an old man standing near the edge of the briefing table like he'd wandered in from another decade. His posture relaxed, his presence almost invisible if not for the faint scrape of boots on polished concrete as Staff Sergeant Ryan Cole stepped closer, eyes narrowing with casual curiosity that quickly turned into something sharper, something edged with mockery, because on the left shoulder of the old man's faded field jacket sat a patch that didn't belong, not to any unit they recognized, not to any archive they had memorized, just a dull piece of fabric, edges worn, threads uneven, colors long since surrendered to time, and that alone made it a target. "Where'd you dig that up?" Cole said, his voice light, but carrying just enough weight to pull the attention of the others, a few operators glancing over, then lingering, because this was how it always started, a small irregularity, a detail out of place, something to poke at, something to test, and the old man didn't answer, didn't even look at him, his pale blue eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room, as if the walls weren't there, as if the noise didn't matter, and that silence, that complete refusal to engage, only made it worse. "Let me guess," another operator added, leaning back against a metal cabinet, arms crossed, a faint grin forming. "Surplus store special, huh?" A few quiet chuckles followed, not loud, not cruel, just enough to fill the space with that familiar edge of superiority, the kind that came easy when you believed you had already proven everything worth proving. And still the old man said nothing, just stood there, steady, like he had all the time in the world, like he had already outweighed things far heavier than a room full of young men with sharp uniforms and sharper attitudes. And Cole reached out, not aggressive, not yet, just curious in that careless way, his gloved fingers brushing the edge of the patch, expecting cheap stitching, expecting something new pretending to be old. But the moment his hand made contact, he paused, just for a fraction of a second, because the fabric wasn't what he expected. It was rough, uneven, like it had been repaired more than once, like it had survived something it shouldn't have, and he frowned slightly, tilting his head. "What is this supposed to be?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, and across the room, unnoticed by most, specialist. Ethan Cruz had already stepped closer to a terminal, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, eyes flicking between the patch and the screen as if trying to match something that didn't quite exist, while the low hum of the room continued, conversations resuming in fragments, laughter fading into the background. But something had shifted, something subtle, like a change in pressure before a storm, and the old man finally moved, not away, not defensive, just a slight adjustment of his stance, the faint creak of worn leather echoing softly, his gaze lowering for just a moment, not to the men around him, but to the patch itself, and in that brief glance, there was something else, something deeper, like a memory brushing the surface without fully rising, like the distant echo of rotor blades carried on a wind no one else could feel, and then it was gone, leaving only silence where a response should have been, a silence that lingered just long enough to make even the most confident among them hesitate, though none of them would admit it, not yet. The room did not return to normal, not completely, because something small had shifted in the air, something most of them could not name, but all of them could feel, like a frequency just outside hearing that made the edges of every sound slightly sharper, and Ryan Cole noticed it even if he refused to acknowledge it, his hand still hovering near the patch for a moment longer than it should have before he pulled it back with a short scoff, brushing it off like it meant nothing. "Feels like it came out of a museum," he said, louder now, reclaiming control of the moment, and a couple of the others nodded, quick to fall back into rhythm, into the easy confidence that had carried them through every room they had ever entered. But the laughter that followed did not land the same way. It was thinner, less certain, and across the room Ethan Cruz was no longer pretending this was just background noise, his fingers moving across the keyboard with quiet precision, pulling up internal archives, unit registries, insignia databases that had been drilled into every operator during training, because nothing official went unrecorded. Nothing legitimate existed without a trace, and yet the screen in front of him returned nothing. Not even a close match, not even a corrupted entry, just clean absence. And that absence made his jaw tighten slightly as he leaned closer, adjusting parameters, widening the search, cross-referencing older files, declassified fragments, anything that might explain the symbol stitched into that worn piece of fabric, while behind him Cole circled once, slow, deliberate, like he was inspecting something that did not belong in his space. "You hear that?" one of the operators muttered under his breath, nodding toward the old man. Guy has not said a word. And that was true. Not a single word, not a reaction, not even a flicker of irritation, just that same steady stillness, the kind that did not push back, but did not give ground either. And it unsettled them in a way they did not understand, because they were used to reactions, used to resistance or respect, something they could measure, something they could respond to. But this was neither. This was something else entirely. And Ethan's screen finally stopped scrolling, a line of text blinking where results should have been, his search query still active, still running, still returning nothing, and he felt a cold, quiet realization settle in his chest, not dramatic, not sudden, just a slow certainty that this was not a glitch, this was intentional, and he glanced over his shoulder again, studying the patch more carefully now, the uneven stitching, the slight discoloration where heat or time had altered the threads. Details that did not belong to something manufactured in bulk, details that suggested history without documentation. And that was when he reached for his phone, not hesitating, not asking permission, stepping just far enough away to keep his voice low as he dialed a number he had never expected to use for something like this. While back near the table, Cole exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like he had already decided the outcome. "All right, old-timer," he said, his tone shifting just enough to test for a response again. "You going to tell us what this thing is, or are we supposed to keep guessing?" And the old man finally moved his gaze, not toward Cole, not toward any of them, but toward the far wall where a faint reflection of the room shimmered in the polished surface, and for a brief second, something flickered behind his eyes, not emotion exactly, not something easy to define, just a trace of something older, something that did not belong to this place. And then it settled again, leaving only the same quiet presence that had been there from the start, unchanged, unmoved, as if whatever answer they were waiting for was never going to come from him at all. The call connected on the second ring, a clipped voice on the other end answering with the kind of precision that came from years of controlled environments and disciplined communication, and Ethan Cruz did not waste time with introductions or context beyond what was necessary, his tone low, measured, each word chosen carefully as he described the patch, the stitching, the lack of registry. And there was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough to feel deliberate, not confusion, not hesitation, but recognition being processed in silence. And when the voice returned, it had changed, the edges sharper, the pace slower. "Say that again," the man requested, and Ethan did, repeating every detail exactly. While across the room Ryan Cole had shifted his stance again, impatience beginning to creep into his posture as the lack of response from the old man stretched the moment thin. "You know," Cole said, glancing at the others with a faint smirk that did not quite reach his eyes. Usually when someone wears something like that, they have a story ready. A few of the operators nodded, but none of them stepped forward this time. None of them reached out again, because something about the stillness of the man had begun to settle into the edges of their awareness, subtle but persistent, like a pressure they could not ignore, and the old man remained exactly as he was, shoulders relaxed, gaze distant, as if the room and everything in it were simply passing through his field of view without ever truly touching him. And back on the line, Ethan heard movement, not loud, not chaotic, just the quiet shift of someone standing up, a chair sliding back across a hard floor somewhere far removed from this base. And then the voice returned again, lower now, controlled in a different way. "Do not let anyone remove it," the man said, each word landing with quiet authority, and Ethan felt his grip tighten slightly around the phone. "Sir, I did not say anything about removing it," he replied, confusion threading into his tone, and there was another pause, shorter this time. "You did not have to," the voice answered, and then the line went dead, leaving Ethan staring at the screen for a fraction of a second before he slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned, his expression no longer neutral, no longer uncertain, but focused, intent, and he stepped back toward the group just as Cole exhaled sharply, clearly done waiting. "All right," he said, voice firmer now, stepping closer again, closing the space by a foot or two. "Last chance, old man." And this time the words hung differently, heavier, not aggressive but final, and the old man's eyes shifted once more, not to Cole, not to anyone in particular, but downward, just slightly, toward the patch on his own shoulder. And for the briefest moment the room seemed to fade around him, not visibly, not in a way anyone else could see, but in the way silence deepens before a distant sound reaches you. And somewhere far away, carried on memory rather than air, there was the faint echo of a radio crackling, a voice cutting through static with a calm that did not belong to panic. "Reaper 1, confirm position." And then nothing, the sound dissolving as quickly as it had surfaced, leaving only the present again, the hum of the lights, the quiet shuffle of boots, the weight of unspoken questions pressing in from every direction, and the old man lifted his gaze just enough to meet the empty space ahead of him, not offering an answer, not acknowledging the demand, but in that silence there was something else now, something that had not been there before, not defiance, not resistance, but a kind of certainty, as if whatever name they were trying to pull from him had already been spoken long ago and did not need to be said again, and across the room Ethan Cruz stopped 2 steps short of the group, watching, waiting, because he understood now that the next moment was not going to belong to any of them. No one noticed the door at first, not because it was quiet, but because the room had already fallen into a silence that swallowed smaller sounds, the kind of silence that makes even a simple hinge feel distant, delayed, as if reality itself was taking an extra second to catch up. And it was Ethan Cruz who saw it before anyone else. His eyes shifting past the line of operators to the far end of the bay, where the heavy steel door had opened just enough to reveal a figure stepping through with measured precision, not hurried, not announced, but carrying a presence that moved ahead of him like a pressure wave. And Ethan straightened instinctively, not out of habit but recognition, the kind that does not come from rank insignia or formal introduction, but from something deeper, something learned over time. And Ryan Cole was still focused forward, still waiting for an answer that was never going to come, his patience thinning into irritation as he drew a breath to speak again. But the words never left his mouth, because one by one the operators around him began to shift, subtle at first, shoulders tightening, heads turning, conversations dying mid-thought as awareness rippled through the room, without a single command being given. And Cole felt it then, that same shift, that same unspoken change, and he turned just slightly, just enough to catch sight of the man approaching, tall, composed, his uniform immaculate, every line sharp, every movement controlled, and the recognition hit immediately, not dramatic, not loud, just absolute. Colonel Marcus Whitaker, and the effect was instant, posture straightening, boots adjusting, eyes forward, the room aligning itself without a word being spoken. And yet the colonel did not acknowledge any of them, not at first, his gaze moving past the operators, past the table, past everything that would normally demand his attention, locking instead onto the single detail that had drawn him here, the worn patch on the old man's shoulder, and something in his expression changed in that moment, not visibly to everyone, but enough, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness that replaced motion, as if time itself had paused just long enough for recognition to settle in. And he slowed, not out of hesitation but control, each step deliberate as he closed the remaining distance, the faint echo of his boots against the floor the only sound left in the room. And Cole felt his throat tighten without understanding why, his earlier confidence slipping away in small, unnoticeable pieces as he watched the colonel stop a few feet away from the old man, close enough to see every detail, every worn thread, every imperfection that had once seemed insignificant. And for a long second nothing happened, no orders, no questions, no explanation, just silence, heavy and complete. And then the colonel's voice came, low, steady, carrying the weight of something far beyond rank alone. "Who authorized anyone to touch that?" he said, not loud, not sharp, but absolute, and no one answered, no one moved, because the question was not meant to be answered, it was meant to be understood. And the colonel took one final step forward, his posture straightening even further, his presence sharpening into something unmistakable, something that shifted the balance of the entire room in an instant. And without breaking his gaze from the patch, he spoke again, quieter this time, but somehow even more powerful. "You do not touch that." And the words settled into the space like a command carved in stone, unchallengeable, irreversible, and only then did his eyes lift, not to the operators, not to Cole, but to the man himself, and in that moment the room held its breath, waiting for something it could not yet name, something that was already beginning to unfold whether they understood it or not. The shift in the room did not fade after the colonel spoke. It deepened, settling into the bones of every man present like something final, something that could not be undone, and Ryan Cole felt it most of all, standing just a few feet away, the weight of his earlier words still hanging in the air, but now stripped of all certainty, reduced to something smaller, something that did not belong anymore. And he swallowed once, subtly, his posture adjusting without conscious thought as he took half a step back, not retreating, not fully, but enough to create space where there had been none, while Colonel Whitaker remained exactly where he was, his attention fixed entirely on the old man, as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching out not awkwardly but deliberately, like a pause that carried meaning on its own. And then, slowly, the colonel's expression shifted again, the sharp authority softening into something quieter, something closer to recognition than command, and he drew in a breath, controlled, measured, before straightening fully, every line of his uniform aligning with precision, his shoulders squared, his stance firm. And those who knew him, even slightly, understood immediately that this was not posture for authority. This was something else entirely, something reserved, something rare, and Ethan Cruz felt it from where he stood, a chill of understanding running through him as the pieces connected in a way that left no room for doubt. And the colonel's voice came again, lower now, steadier, carrying a weight that seemed to reach beyond the room itself. "I asked you a question," he said, not to the operators, not to Cole, but to the silence that had been left behind. And then he shifted his gaze, not away from the patch but through it, as if looking past the fabric into something older, something that had not been spoken of in years. And when he spoke again, it was no longer a question, it was a statement, quiet but absolute. "That insignia does not exist on any current record," he said. And a few of the operators exchanged brief glances, uncertain, because that alone should have ended the matter, should have dismissed the patch as meaningless. But the tone in his voice carried the opposite truth, and he took one final step forward, closing the last bit of distance between himself and the old man. His presence no longer just authoritative but reverent in a way that none of them had ever seen before, and Ryan Cole felt his breath catch slightly as the realization began to form, incomplete but undeniable, and the colonel stopped, standing at full attention now, not exaggerated, not ceremonial, just precise, exact. And then, without raising his voice, without adding emphasis, he spoke a name that did not sound like a title, did not sound like a rank, but landed with more weight than either. "Reaper One," he said, and the words settled into the room like something that had been waiting to be spoken for a very long time. And no one moved, no one reacted, not immediately, because the meaning of it had not yet fully reached them. But it was there, expanding, filling the silence with a presence that made everything else seem smaller. And the old man finally turned his head, just slightly, his eyes meeting the colonel's for the first time, and there was no surprise in them, no confusion, just a quiet acknowledgement, the kind shared between people who did not need explanations. And the colonel held that gaze for a brief second longer before giving the smallest nod, not a command, not a gesture of authority, but something closer to respect. And behind them the room remained completely still, every operator frozen in place, caught between what they had believed moments ago and what they were beginning to understand now. A realization unfolding in silence, irreversible, undeniable, and far heavier than anything they had expected when they first noticed a simple patch on an old man's shoulder. The name did not echo, it did not need to. because it landed exactly where it was meant to, settling into the room with a weight that bypassed sound entirely. And for a long second no one moved. No one spoke, as if the simple act of breathing had become something that required permission, and Ryan Cole felt it in the tightness of his chest, the slow realization that whatever line had existed before was gone now, replaced by something he could not define but instinctively understood was not his. To cross, and he lowered his gaze just slightly, not in submission, not consciously, but because looking directly at the old man now felt different, felt heavier, like staring at something that carried more history than he was prepared to process. While Colonel Whitaker remained perfectly still, his posture unchanged, his eyes steady, holding that quiet acknowledgement with the man in front of him. And there was no need for further explanation, not between them, not after a name like that had been spoken aloud. And yet the room demanded something, some kind of grounding, some point of reference that the others could hold on to, because without it the silence threatened to stretch into something endless. And it was Ethan Cruz who felt that pressure most clearly, his mind already racing ahead, connecting fragments, recalling the tone of the voice on the phone, the absence of records. The instruction that had come without context but now made perfect sense, and he took a slow breath, steadying himself, before stepping forward just enough to be heard without breaking the moment. His voice careful, controlled. "Sir," he said, directing the word toward the colonel, though his eyes flicked briefly to the old man. There is no record of that designation in any accessible archive, and the statement hung there, factual, neutral, but carrying an implication that was anything but simple, and Whitaker's gaze shifted slightly, not fully turning, just enough to acknowledge the presence of another voice. And when he spoke again it was softer, quieter, but no less certain. "There would not be," he said, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any detailed explanation ever could, because it confirmed what none of them had been ready to accept, that this was not a matter of missing data or outdated files. This was something that had never been meant to be found in the first place, and a subtle shift moved through the operators, not visible in large gestures but in the smallest adjustments, shoulders straightening, hands stilling, eyes refocusing, as if each of them was recalibrating their understanding of the man standing before them in real time. And Ryan Cole exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him more measured now, more controlled, as the last remnants of his earlier certainty dissolved completely, replaced by something quieter, something closer to respect than he had expected to feel. And he took another half step back, creating space not out of instruction but instinct, and the old man finally moved again. Not much, just a slight turn of his shoulders, his gaze shifting from the colonel to the room itself, taking in the faces that had once looked at him with casual dismissal and now held something entirely different, something unspoken but unmistakable. And for a brief moment his eyes paused on Ethan, just long enough to acknowledge the call that had been made, the chain that had been set in motion, and then they moved on, settling once more into that same quiet distance, as if none of this had altered him at all, as if the recognition, the silence, the weight of the name that had just been spoken were all things he had carried long before any of them had noticed the patch on his shoulder. And Colonel Whitaker drew in a slow breath, his posture easing just slightly, not losing its precision but softening at the edges. And when he spoke again it was not to command, not to explain, but simply to mark the moment for what it was. "Stand down," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that needed no reinforcement, and the room obeyed instantly, not out of habit, not out of rank alone, but because something deeper had already taken hold, something that did not require orders to be understood. And as the tension began to settle into a new kind of stillness, one built not on uncertainty but on quiet recognition, it became clear to every man in that room that whatever they had thought they were witnessing when this began, they had been wrong, and that the truth of it was far simpler and far heavier than any of them had expected. The command settled over the room like a final line drawn in the sand, and with it came a shift that no one could ignore, not anymore, because this was no longer a moment of confusion or uncertainty. It had become something defined, something understood, and the operators adjusted accordingly, not in exaggerated movements, but in small, precise corrections, shoulders squared, hands still, eyes forward, The kind of alignment that came not from habit but from recognition, and Ryan Cole stood among them, his earlier posture completely gone now, replaced by a quiet stillness that mirrored the others, his gaze no longer searching for answers but holding steady, fixed somewhere just short of the man they had misjudged. And it was in that stillness that something else began to surface, not from the colonel, not from the room, but from the weight of the name that had been spoken, because Reaper One did not carry explanation. It carried implication, and that implication lingered in the silence like a distant echo. And for the first time since this began, the old man shifted more noticeably, not reacting, not responding, but moving with a deliberate ease, his hand lifting slowly toward the patch, fingers brushing the edge with a familiarity that spoke of years rather than moments. And the room seemed to narrow around that single motion, every eye drawn to it without anyone realizing they had moved. And as his hand rested there, just briefly, something in his gaze changed again, not outwardly, not in a way that could be easily described, but in a way that suggested distance, as if his attention had moved somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the present. And for a fleeting second the air itself seemed heavier, filled with something unseen, something remembered, and though no one else could hear it, there was the faintest suggestion of sound, not loud, not clear, just a trace, like the distant hum of rotor blades carried on a wind that no longer existed, a rhythm that did not belong to this place. And then it was gone, replaced once more by the quiet hum of the room, by the steady breathing of men who now understood that they were standing in the presence of something far older than their assumptions. And Colonel Whitaker watched this without interruption, his expression unchanged but his attention absolute, allowing the moment to exist without forcing it forward, because some things did not need to be explained. They needed to be acknowledged, and that acknowledgement was already taking shape in the posture of every man present, in the silence that no one dared break, in the absence of questions where there had once been plenty, and Ethan Cruz felt it settle fully now, the earlier uncertainty replaced by clarity, not in the details, not in the specifics of what Reaper One meant or where it came from, but in the certainty that it mattered, that it carried weight beyond anything recorded or documented. And he straightened slightly, his stance aligning with the others, not out of obligation but understanding, and Ryan Cole exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured, his eyes lifting just enough to glance at the old man once more. And this time there was no trace of mockery, no curiosity sharpened into challenge, only a quiet respect that had formed without being spoken, and the old man lowered his hand from the patch. The motion complete, the memory contained once again beneath the surface, and he remained as he had been from the start, calm, steady, unchanged, as if nothing in this room had altered him at all, as if the shift had only ever been theirs to make. And as the silence held, firm and unbroken, it became clear that the moment had passed its turning point, that whatever lesson had been waiting in the space between misunderstanding and recognition had already been delivered, not through words, not through explanation, but through the simple, undeniable presence of a man who had never needed to prove anything at all. Time did not snap back to normal. It eased into something quieter, something steadier, like a current settling after a disturbance, and the room remained aligned in that stillness, not out of tension anymore, but out of understanding, the kind that does not require constant reinforcement. And Colonel Whitaker was the first to move, not abruptly, not with any break in composure, just a subtle shift of weight as he stepped back half a pace, enough to give space without withdrawing respect, his gaze never leaving the old man. And when he spoke again his voice had changed, the edge of command replaced by something lower, something measured with care. "We were not expecting you today," he said, and the words carried no accusation, no surprise, only acknowledgement, and the old man's eyes lifted slightly, meeting the colonel's once more, and for a brief moment there was the faintest hint of something like recognition passing between them, not new, not forming, but remembered, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if confirming something that had never needed to be spoken aloud, and the colonel inclined his head in return, a gesture so controlled it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not already watching closely. But every man in that room was watching now, every detail registering in a way it had not before, because they understood that what they were witnessing was not performance. It was protocol of a different kind, one that existed outside formal training and written orders. And Ryan Cole felt it settle deeper into him with every passing second. The realization that respect was not something assigned by rank alone. It was something recognized, something earned long before anyone present had ever stepped into uniform. And he shifted his stance again, this time fully stepping back into line, his boots aligning with the others, his posture firm, his gaze steady, not out of obligation but choice. And across the room, Ethan Cruz exhaled slowly, the last trace of tension leaving his shoulders as clarity replaced uncertainty. And he understood now why the voice on the phone had changed, why the instruction had come without explanation, because there were things that did not belong in reports, things that were not meant to be written down or filed away. And this was one of them. And the old man remained at the center of it all without ever claiming it, without ever speaking a word to define it, his presence unchanged, his expression calm, as if this moment was no different from any other, as if recognition and silence carried the same weight to him. And Colonel Whitaker straightened once more, his posture returning to full precision, but the atmosphere around him had shifted permanently, no longer commanding attention but holding it in quiet balance. And he turned slightly, just enough to address the room without breaking the connection entirely. "Resume your stations," he said, the words clear, controlled, but lacking the urgency that usually accompanied such orders, and the operators moved immediately, not rushing, not scrambling, but stepping back into position with measured efficiency, the sound of boots against concrete returning in soft, even rhythms, conversations not resuming, not yet, because the silence still held, not as tension but as respect. And Ryan Cole hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning, his eyes flicking once more toward the old man. And in that glance there was no question left, no doubt, only acknowledgement. And then he faced forward, aligning with the others, and the room began to function again, systems humming, screens glowing, the structure of routine re-establishing itself around a moment that had already passed into something permanent. And the old man remained where he was for a few seconds longer, watching none of it, needing none of it, before finally shifting his weight slightly, as if preparing to move on, as if the entire encounter had been nothing more than a brief pause in a much longer path. And Colonel Whitaker did not stop him, did not question him, simply stepped aside just enough to clear the way, his posture unchanged, his respect unmistakable. And as the old man took his first step toward the exit, the room did not turn to follow, did not break formation, but every man present felt it, the quiet gravity of his departure, a presence moving out of the space without ever having needed to dominate it, leaving behind nothing visible, nothing tangible, except for the undeniable understanding that some names were not spoken to be explained, they were spoken to be remembered. The door closed behind him without sound, or at least that was how it felt, because no one in the room could later say exactly when it happened, only that at some point the space he had occupied was no longer there, and yet the weight of it remained, settled into the air like something that did not leave easily. And for several seconds after his departure the room continued exactly as it had been, operators at their stations, screens active, systems running, but there was a difference now, a quiet awareness threaded through every movement, every glance, as if something unseen had recalibrated the way they stood, the way they listened, the way they understood the uniform they wore. And Ryan Cole felt it most clearly, standing at his position with his hands steady, his eyes forward. And for the first time since this began, his thoughts were not searching for control, not trying to define what had happened, but simply holding on to it, replaying the smallest details, the texture of the patch beneath his glove, the way the colonel's voice had changed, the weight of a name spoken without explanation. And he drew in a slow breath, deeper than before, letting it settle, letting it stay, because some lessons were not meant to be dissected, they were meant to be carried. And across the room Ethan Cruz remained still for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes drifting briefly toward the door before returning to his screen, though he was not really looking at it, not yet, because his mind was still anchored to that single realization, that absence could mean more than presence, that something not recorded could still hold more authority than anything written down. And he nodded once, almost to himself, before placing his hands back on the keyboard, his posture aligned, his focus restored, but different now, sharpened by understanding rather than routine, and Colonel Whitaker stood where he had stepped aside, his gaze lingering on the closed door for just a fraction. Longer before he turned back to the room, his expression composed, his authority unchanged, but there was something quieter in it now, something that did not need to be displayed to be felt, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself, as if marking its place before letting it pass. And then he resumed his position fully, the structure of command settling back into place without friction, without disruption, because it had never truly left. It had only made room for something older to pass through, and the room moved forward, not forgetting, not dismissing, but integrating what had just occurred into something that would remain long after the day ended, long after the details blurred. And Ryan Cole shifted his stance once more, subtle, precise, his boots aligned, his shoulders squared. And though no one said it, though no one needed to, the change was there, in the way he carried himself, in the absence of the easy arrogance that had once come so naturally, replaced now by something steadier, something earned in silence. And as the steady hum of the operations bay filled the space again, as voices slowly returned in low, measured tones, the patch that had started it all was no longer visible, no longer present in the room, but its meaning remained, embedded, in the memory of every man who had seen it, who had felt the shift it carried. And in that quiet, unspoken understanding, the lesson settled fully into place, not as a rule, not as an order, but as something far simpler and far more lasting. That respect is not given by what can be seen, it is revealed by what has already been lived, and some names are never meant to be explained, only recognized when the time comes, and remembered long after they are gone.